So today we're going to be talking about beating the House's big extinction bill, and some of y'all might already be thinking this sounds very familiar to me. I'm a little curious as to why we're beating the big extinction bill again. Some of y'all might remember us messaging about this. We're calling this the 2026 version because it's even worse than the last big extinction bill we talked about. We're going to talk about this policy, the policy behind it, kind of this appropriations process, which is what this is in the wonky terms. Try to make that a little bit more understandable, and then we'll talk about what we can do to really win on this. So, I want to talk introductions first. You're going to hear from everybody on the panel who you'll be hearing from today. We've got a number of great organizations, but I also want to see in the chat. So, why are y'all here? Who told you about this? Maybe it was the Endangered Species Coalition, the Sierra Club, ABC, one of these organizations. Maybe you saw it on Instagram. And where are you from? And so many of y'all are already doing a great job of the where you're from, but it's always great to see folks across the nation just to kind of have an understanding of how strong we are, right? And how big our movement is. So yeah, we've got Tennessee. A lot of folks got our email. I'm glad to hear that. Text from Jewel. That's awesome. I always love getting a text from Jewel. And I'll go ahead and introduce myself while we're getting these in the chat. So my name is Dalton George. I work for the Endangered Species Coalition. I'm the national organizing director. I'm based in Boone, North Carolina, which is in the western part of our state. And I'll be talking a little bit about organizing later on and helping facilitate us through this. And I'll go ahead and let Kristen introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kristen Combs. I'm the executive director at Wyoming Wildlife Advocates, based in Jackson, Wyoming.
Awesome. And then we'll go to Ben.
Yeah, hello, folks. Ben Gruhl. I'm the wildlife campaign manager for the Sierra Club nationally, and I'm based here in rainy and brisk Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Great. Hardy.
Hey everyone, so happy to be here. Hardy Kern, I'm Director of Government Relations for American Bird Conservancy. I'm based in Columbus, Ohio, but ABC works across the whole country. And yeah, psyched to be able to share a message with everyone today.
Great. Tim.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, as the case may be. I'm Tim Peterson, Cultural Landscapes Director with the Grand Canyon Trust, based in the Animas Valley, just outside of Durango, Colorado, Four Corners region.
And last but not least, Jewel.
Hello, I'm Jewel Thomasula, National Policy Director at the Endangered Species Coalition, and I'm based here in the DC area. Nice to see y'all today.
And y'all have already got me excited with the people across the country. I'm very optimistic about what we can do if we just turn out even everybody on this call. And so I want to talk a bit about our agenda today to tell you what to expect. So we're looking at about an hour. So we've just done our introductions. We want to talk about, what is the appropriation process? What are appropriations? Then we're going to talk about something called poison pill riders, which sounds really bad because they are very bad. I don't think anything sounds more dangerous than a poison pill rider. We're going to talk about what the heck that is, and also give you a list of all the poison pill riders in one piece of legislation. Then we're going to tell y'all, of course, what we believe in doing, which is how we can win about it. We don't want to just tell y'all how bad things are. We want to tell you about what we can do to really reverse this and make sure that we're looking out for wildlife and public lands. And in that, to that end, we're going to talk a little bit about commitments, right? Making some phone calls, making sure that we're talking to our communities about it, and sharing information about this really troubling piece of legislation. Then we'll close out, and y'all can get back to y'all's afternoons. And I will just say that, and I think this is Jules going to tag team a little bit on this slide, but let me just say, we really can win on this. I think that the one thing I want to frame up is the U.S. House is in a bad way right now. And unless somebody out there wants to put in the chat and say, actually, I think the U.S. House has been great lately, I feel like that's kind of a shared sentiment from so many people. And it's been getting worse, right? They're not reflecting the things that our communities care about. They're continuing to push anti-wildlife legislation that attacks public lands, that seeks to deregulate or defund key environmental protections. And they tried to do something very similar last year. And the important thing is that we actually won on it through a very similar webinar, through very similar organizing efforts and conversations. We were able to win. And this is very much the same. This is the same type of work, right? And it's showing up every time because they're counting on us really not paying attention and letting them proceed and pointing out or I guess being supportive of anti-wildlife policy and not realizing how toxic it is to our communities. And so I think I'm going to toss this over to Jewel, who's going to talk to you all a little bit about the policy in and outs and what appropriations are.
Thanks, Dalton. Yeah, so we need to fight hard against this bill, HR 9171. As Dalton noted, this was a bill introduced at the beginning of June, and to fight against it effectively, we need to understand like what it is, why it's so problematic. And so the first term here is that it's an appropriations bill. And we know that's not a term that people use day to day. It's pretty specific to Congress. But what we want you to understand is that appropriations bills allocate money to operate our government departments. So that includes the Department of Interior and the agencies within it, like the National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And these agencies provide a crucial public services, and those services can't happen unless there's a law that provides them the funding they need to operate. And so Congress is going through this process on a year-to-year basis. It means every year Congress has to write these bills and they go through that lawmaking process. All right, next slide. But this process, because it's so important, it's such a big thing for Congress to do, it has its own sort of process that's maybe a little different than the typical civics understanding of a bill going through each chamber and making it to the desk. It's more of a tug of war negotiation process. And with appropriations, we see a bit of a parallel introduction of bills where the House of Representatives puts forward its version, and at the same time, the Senate is developing and advancing its own version. And then these two chambers come together for a negotiation. And in that, each side is trying to get the final version to look as much like its own bill as possible. And unfortunately, what we see from the House of Representatives is an appropriations bill that's filled with what we call these poison pill riders. These provisions in the bill are eliminating or weakening wildlife protection, and there's so many of them. They can't all fit on this slide. We'll talk about them in a bit. And I'll note we haven't seen the Senate's version yet, and we don't expect it to be our ideal given the challenging political dynamics that we're working with, but we do expect it to be survivable, much more reasonable, and not including these terrible poison pill riders. And that's based on what we saw last year and what we're understanding about positions of senators this year. But this is the setup that we're in. Like when we see HR 9171, when we oppose it, we are weakening the House's position. When we make that bill toxic, when we really come out strong against it, we're weakening the House in this tug of war, and we're signaling to the Senate that they should not be including these poison pill riders. And we are, part of the team that's pulling for a bill that is clean and much better for our wildlife, and at least not pushing them to extinction the way that the House's bill does. All right, next slide, please. But in this negotiations process, there's also this very real threat of government shutdown. The current government funding runs out on September 30th, 2026. And right now we've seen the House's bill. We know the Senate is working on their version. But if Congress can't reach an agreement or agree to extend their deadline, then we could see a government shutdown, which is really consequential, stopping public services, and has impacts across the country. It would be really hard situation. And with those stakes hanging over the process, the House of Representatives and these extreme members are trying to take advantage of that situation to slash funding and sneak in these poison pill riders. Right, next slide. So with that set up, let's talk specifically about why the House's bill, HR 9171, is so bad. It is reducing funding for Endangered Species Act listing procedures by 48%. It's cutting the Endangered Species Act planning and consultation by 9%, cuts $16 million from the National Wildlife Refuges. It's cutting the Environmental Protection Agency budget by 20%. And these are really drastic cuts to programs that are providing these essential services and protections. Right, next slide. Now, the poison pill riders. We've talked about those. Let's get into some specifics. It's including these sections of the bill that take away the Endangered Species Act protections for gray wolves and grizzly bears. It's weakening the management plan for Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. It's making it harder to protect birds that are vulnerable to lead poisoning. All these sections get stuffed into the House's bill. And some of you may be familiar with bills like H.R. 845, led by Representative Boebert, that would remove protections for gray wolves. The language from that bill is included in H.R. 9171 word for word. And that's true for many of these riders, that they are these standalone bills that didn't really have a path forward on their own. But when they're attached to a high stakes appropriations package, it's more of a chance that they become law. That is a strategy we often see from these extreme members of Congress that push for these. And so that's why it's so important that we make that connection and fight just as hard against HR 9171 as we fought against those other standalone bills. So next slide, please. And in this bill, we're seeing a record number of these harmful riders. We've seen more than 30 affecting wildlife, public lands, and waters. So next slide. This is more of a list for them to give you a sense. Greater sage grouse, lesser prairie chicken, northern spotted owls, Canada lynx, our national forests, all the species there, species in Alaska. And this is just giving more of an overview here, but this bill is truly so damaging, and that's why we're calling it the Big Extinction Bill. With this, I'm passing it back to you, Dalton.
Great. And so the folks that introduced themselves earlier, they really want to go in depth on a couple of the poison pills in here that are especially troubling and highlight kind of the nuances. And to Jules' point, right, all of these things are happening in one single vote. That's what's so unreal about this. This is the Boebert bill. This is the grizzly delisting bill. This is, an attack on public lands and so on and so forth. And so each of these organizations are going to share a little bit about what that means, specific rider means for them. And I'm going to invite Tim with Grand Canyon Trust to share a little bit about the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument.
Thanks, Dalton. So right behind me, my background photo here is a photo of Grand Staircase Escalante. This is the Grand Staircase portion. You can kind of see why it's called that. Steps up from the Paria River here, all the way up to the top of the Aquarius Plateau, Vermilion Cliffs, Pink Cliffs, White Cliffs, and it's a huge kind of geologic eruption as a result of some really dramatic processes. I'll say a little bit more about the monument just for folks who don't know. It was first designated in 1996 by President Clinton, about 1.6 million acres. It was then enlarged by a state land exchange and another couple of boundary adjustment bills. Then in 2017, President Trump unlawfully cut the national monument in half, removing national monument protections from about 1 million acres of the place. There was a huge campaign and lawsuits and litigation in reaction to that, and it was restored to its full size in 2021 by President Biden. The monument was really designed to protect a spectacular array of scientific and historic resources, geology, dinosaur fossils, plants, animals, and of course, cultural places. It was also the first national monument to be managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The intent there was to try to evolve the culture of the BLM from being the Bureau of Livestock and Mining to give them kind of a protection mandate. And the jury's still kind of out on how that's working out, but that was the intent. It was also known as the Science Monument. A whole bunch of research has taken place there. More than 24 species of dinosaur new to science have been identified there, and more than 660 species of native bees. So the proclamation or the thing that's relevant to this appropriations bill is the 2025 management plan for this monument. It was created in response to the Biden proclamation restoring the place. And it was a compromise, which was the result of years of collaboration and exhaustive public input. And what's particularly unique about this new management plan is the inclusion of traditional knowledge, indigenous traditional knowledge, and also a tribal co-stewardship framework. And up until last week, this monument management plan itself was under a double threat. Next slide. So we expected President Trump to act on day one of his second term. We had heard that there were proclamations to either get rid of or reduce the monument on day one. When that didn't end up happening, and then we went through most of 2025 without executive action, two politicians from Utah, Senator Mike Lee and Representative Celeste Malloy, they began different ways to attack the good management plan using the Congressional Review Act. So the Congressional Review Act is a law that allows Congress to disapprove of rules and regulations. Up until this Congress, and management plans had never been considered rules. They've really escalated the attack on public lands using this law in unprecedented and new ways. And they're doing this by just asking the Government Accountability Office to issue an opinion saying that land management plan is a rule subject to being reversed by the CRA. So Celeste Malloy asked for the opinion. She got it in January. And in March, Lee and Malloy had introduced bills to overturn this good 2025 plan. And more than that, the CRA prohibits any plan in the future that is substantially the same, which means that a lot of usually good things in the plan cannot ever happen. That's a very bad thing. The CRA is a blunt instrument. There was a full court press, national conservation, recreation, hunting and fishing organizations, and also tribes to defeat this. And next slide. Part of CRA also includes what's a fast track provision. And just waiting for the slide to change there, got a little internet lag. Hasn't changed for me yet. Well, anyway, so the CRA also includes a provision that it's subject to a 60 vote, it exempts the filibuster in the Senate. So it's subject to a simple majority in the Senate, but they have 60 session days from when that resolution is introduced in order to pass the bill. And on June 11th, Senator Mike Lee missed the deadline and there was no action in the Senate. So rare and sweet victory, that plan has failed. There's some really notable opposition to the bill. Of course, the Grand Staircase Susquehanna Intertribal Coalition made up of the Hopi tribe, Navajo Nation, Kaibab Paiute tribe, the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah, Ute Mountain Ute tribe, and the Zuni tribe. The National Congress of American Indians came out in strong opposition. Navajo Utah Commission and therefore Navajo Nation Council also opposed. Dozens of interfaith leaders, 150 plus scientists who've worked in the monument, local business owners, and then of course a unified conservation community. Next slide. We'll never know exactly why it failed, but it's most likely that Senator Lee needed 30 votes to get that discharge petition to the floor. And if you know about Mike Lee, you know how popular he is. So the logical conclusion is that he didn't get the votes and that it never came up in the House because it wasn't a priority for leadership. So the bad news is that in this appropriations bill, the same good plan is under attack. Celeste Malloy, who is the subcommittee chair, has slipped this language into Section 134. None of the funds available made by this or any other actions for management of the Grand Staircase, except for under the 2020 plan. So it's essentially the same thing. They're trying to put the 2020 plan into place, and that's problematic for a number of reasons. because that Trump era plan dealt with almost half of the land base that is not a national monument. And national monuments, the proclamation establishing those monuments means that they have to be managed to a higher standard. They are not multiple use BLM lands. So that would have set up an immediate conflict and vast uncertainty. It would also erase that landmark tribal co-stewardship framework that was enacted in that 2025 plan, lead to more off-roading, increased risks to cultural places and archaeological sites, would allow the resumption of clear cutting of old growth pinyon juniper forests. And then, among other things, it could also return cattle to 90% of the lands around the Escalante River canyons, which are currently closed, and which the Trust and many others have worked for the last 30 years to try to restore those lands. Utah delegation has tried to do this 4 times with Grand Staircase plans, and they failed every time. So let's keep it going.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. And am I good to share what you said before we started this session that given a long history in working on this, this is one of 4 wins that you can point to that you got recently over Mike Lee. And also, right, we need to win on this because if this were to pass, that would undo really the progress that y'all had on beating what Mike Lee was trying to do. And so re-emphasizing what it means to win on these issues and also just all of the bad elements in a single piece of legislation.
Absolutely.
And now I think we'll toss it over to Kristen.
Great. Thanks, Dalton. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the grizzly bear and wolf delisting, basically, that's included in this bill. And I've got a little map here that shows these recovery zones. Now, when the original recovery plan was written for grizzly bear recovery across the Northern Rockies, there were these recovery zones that were set up in place. And basically, the thought is that there would have to be like viable populations of grizzly bears present in each of these zones before grizzly bears could be considered recovered and delisted. And so we have the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem in the northwest corner of Wyoming. We've got the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem that's in northwest Montana. Then we've got the Selkirks and the Cabinet Yaak, which is northern Idaho into British Columbia and Alberta, and the Bitterroot, which is central Idaho, and also up in the North Cascades, which is a portion that's in central Washington. And so when we look at, if you think about grizzly bears were put on the endangered species list, decades ago, and it's taken us over 50 years to get to the small populations that we have. Right now, there's only about 2,000 grizzlies total in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the Northern Continental Divide. So, most of the Selkirks and the Cabinet Yaak and the Bitterroot ecosystem are not inhabited by grizzlies. There are a few grizzlies that get there every year, and sometimes they can make it to there, but they almost always end up dead, either shot because of mistaken identity from black bear hunters or from conflicts with cattle. And so for the most part, grizzly bears are not present in, especially the Bitterroot ecosystem. They do persist a little bit more in the Cabinet Yaak and Selkirks due to the fact that they can sort of meander across the border with Canada there, and they do have some further wilderness north, but that central part of Idaho is just really uninhabited by grizzlies. There's a few bears there, but most of them end up dead, like I said. So what this rider would do, and when Jewel was talking earlier about Lauren Boebert's bill to delist wolves, is pretty much word for word included in the bill. Well, it's the same with we've got there's 2 standalone bills to delist grizzlies, one from Hageman and one from Lummis in the Senate. And so this is pretty much word for word what they're trying to get at here is to delist bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the Northern Continental Divide. And then also it would basically block any funding to bring reintroductions of bears into the North Cascades and into the Bitterroot. And so that would halt all recovery efforts in those two areas because no longer would grizzlies really be able to get there. It's very difficult for bears to get from British Columbia to the North Cascades. I mean, once again, we've seen, decades without bears present in Washington, and we're still continuing to have like zero or to very few bears located there as well. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service back in the early part of 2025 in January came out with a proposed rule that wanted to create basically a meta population of bears instead of these sort of spread out recovery zones. They wanted to show that there was a unified population of bears across the Northern Rockies before they could be delisted or before bears could, be considered recovered. And that is the best available science. That's what it's showing us, is like we need that population of interconnected bears that can walk and make it and have these connectivity corridors protected between the GYE, the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, and the Bitterroots and the Selkirks. I mean, we need bears to be able to move within there, because if there's low genetic diversity, then that leaves them susceptible to genetic inbreeding and other population bottlenecks that cause problems for bears further down the road. So, really, just a blanket delisting here would make it so that bears could not intermingle, because we will see no protection of travel corridors. And the one thing you got to remember too is like protecting grizzly bears protects the lands that they're on, and grizzly bears need these very large open landscapes. And like that's one of the reasons that most Westerners live in the West, because we like these big open landscapes, but that also protects from mining and logging and oil and gas development. And that's really the driver behind why grizzly bears are trying to be delisted, is because now all of that land would basically not be protected from those things anymore. And perhaps the most the most egregious thing here is that it would prohibit judicial review. So basically an entire branch of government, our judicial system, would be removed from from the people. I mean, like, we have the judicial system, we have these three branches of government to provide checks and balances. And by saying that there can be no judicial review, because what's been happening is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, driven by politics, will try to make a decision to delist grizzlies, but then they will lose in court because they're not following their own mandates to basically, cause to have recovery happen. And so what is occurring is that they're losing because there's not the correct regulatory mechanisms in order, and they're not doing enough to have genetic interchange. And so politicians just want to remove that here and just make it so that that doesn't really matter anymore. So yeah, so for grizzlies, this would be really detrimental. We would see these continued island populations of grizzlies with very little recovery in these other ecosystems that don't really have them, and basically no connectivity for grizzly populations across the Northern Rockies. So, and a definite increase in oil and gas development and timber production and mining, which would be pretty detrimental to these beautiful areas. Next slide. And then as far as wolves go, so wolves right now are delisted in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, parts of Eastern Oregon, and Washington. However, they're still protected in the Great Lakes areas and Western Oregon and Washington and California. So all of those protections would be removed. The provision that is in this bill also calls for the removal of protections for Mexican wolves, which they're hanging on by a thread at this point between recovery. And this would reinstate this U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decision that was issued in November 2020 in the first Trump administration, and then once again was overturned in court because the agency didn't use the best available science. They were pretty much coming at this from a very political standpoint. If you look at the map, you'll see in red, there's those are all areas where wolves could persist and be present. The green area is where they're present currently. So they're only occupying a very small percentage of their historic range. Even in the Great Lakes, they're only found kind of in the northern parts of Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin. And those, as we saw the last time that wolves were delisted in those states, hundreds were killed within a few days of hunting. And we know that if we look at what happens to wolves in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, these states where they are delisted right now, it just states do not have the regulatory mechanisms to keep robust wolf populations in the states due to the fact that we would see we've already seen a return to increased trapping. We have bounties in Idaho and Montana that are paid for wolves to be killed. They're listed as predators in most of the state of Wyoming and can be killed on site any time of the year. And we would, just expect nothing less than that to be occurring in all of these other states as well. So, and once again, blocks judicial review, which is just really an unconstitutional thing to do. And that might be an angle to use with some lawmakers that we have three branches of government that are important so that people can be represented at all, different spots of lawmaking. And this is unconstitutional to the American people to just remove the judicial branch from a decision as big as this. So yeah, we would continue to see basically wolf populations would continue to shrink and there's no way we would ever see. I mean, really what we want to end up in the long term here is to have Northern Rockies wolves and Great Lakes wolves being able to intermingle with each other to provide genetic diversity. That would just never happen under a nationwide delisting plan like this one would be. And this is, once again, Lauren Boebert's bill, I think is called the Livestock and Pet Protection Act. We also know that increased hunting does not lead to safer anything down the line. So, yeah, for the main part here to know is that grizzlies and wolves would just in one fell swoop be delisted under this bill. And we know that the American public does not want to see that. Even polls that have been run in rural areas of the Northern Rockies have shown that people want to continued protections for grizzlies and wolves and really do appreciate those animals on the landscape. So yeah, we just got to continue to keep, and I think this is a really important thing of even if and I think we know that the Western lawmakers, especially the House members, are trying to delist these animals. So that's why we need help from other parts of the country and different representatives from all over the country to help these animals, no matter where you're from. So with that, I will turn it back to Dalton to turn it over to Hardy.
Yeah, and so we know that it's now attacking a monument, right, in public land, and also that it's aiming to delist two of the most charismatic listed species, which is the wolf and the grizzly, and it also does a lot of damage to our bird friends. And so I think the person that's best suited to talk about that is Hardy with American Bird Conservancy.
Thanks, Dalton and friends. It is such a privilege to be here with you today. I love these events, not only because I know that we're going to make a difference, but because I always learn something from the other panelists and from everyone who's writing in. I love the ideas that people are posing, the questions you're asking. I also think at some point we need to get into the irony that we're not going to protect a place where we're still discovering extinct creatures in it, but we'll get there. It's going to be fun. So I'm going to talk a bit about the bird impacts from this bill. And before I do, I'm going to single out one specific species, this gorgeous creature in the middle that kind of looks like a turkey that just walked out of a nightclub. Thank you, sir. That is the greater sage grouse. So next to that, you can see section 116, which is one of these poison pill riders that's attached to this bill. This is why it's so important to have these conversations. That rider was first attached to an appropriations bill saying that the greater sage grouse cannot be listed under the Endangered Species Act 12 years ago. That bird just happens to live in an area that is rich with oil and gas and other fossil fuels and resources, and a compromise to saying, well, we're not going to give them federal protections so that people can still go in and mine that land to remove those resources. We're going to put a 1 year policy rider on the appropriations bill. Just 1 year. It'll probably come off next year. Don't worry while we figure things out. It is 12 years later, and we are still fighting to get that rider removed. And that's why it's so important that we let our members of Congress know about all of these egregious things that get tacked on and the impact they could have. Because if we don't speak up, who knows what could come out of it. So, in addition to the sage grouse still needing our help, I have the word legacy next to that rider because it's what we call a legacy rider. It's one that gets tacked on every year. We also have a rider, Section 123, that prevents the listing of another gorgeous little prairie bird, the lesser prairie chicken, from ever receiving protections under the Endangered Species Act. They had finally, after 20 years of waiting and going back and forth, finally received endangered and threatened status under the ESA last year before it was vacated by a court decision. And now there's this rider that could prevent them from ever regaining those protections, which they desperately need. There's also a rider in there. Krista was talking about these riders preempting judicial decisions. Section 146 is a rider that would revert the critical habitat designation or the areas, the geographic areas that Fish and Wildlife and scientists out on the ground on the West Coast have determined are absolutely essential for the survival of the northern spotted owl. They've said, we want to take their current critical habitat and revert it to what it was 5 years ago. We have more information since then. The populations have declined since then. They've needed to shift it around. But the main motivation for that is not only reducing the amount of critical habitat for the owl, it's opening up more lands to logging. So that's a science decision that a policy writer is trying to preempt. And then the two kind of sandwiching, Section 122 and 434, both have to do with lead. Anyone know how much lead it is safe to be in an organism's body? What level of lead you can have? Ding, ding, ding. Survey says zero, none, nada, zilch. The World Health Organization says there is no safe level of lead that can be in an avian, mammalian, reptilian, amphibian, or fish body and still have them be healthy. And yet, we are seeing policy riders attached that specifically allow for the continued use of lead on our public lands and to prevent them from being regulated under the very statutes that are supposed to make things safer for Americans. So we have Section 122, which says that any federal land that falls under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Interior, so we're talking national parks, wildlife refuges, fish hatcheries, or under the Secretary of Agriculture, which would be national forests, they cannot prohibit the use of lead ammo or tackle on those lands unless you can prove that there has been a mortality event in wildlife on a specific unit of land, so one refuge or one forest, that was generated by lead used just on that one specific unit. So the animal had to ingest lead on that National Wildlife Refuge. That had to be the main cause of death. And even then, if you do want to promulgate a lead prohibition or restriction, you have to get it signed off on by the state wildlife agency. It has to be in accordance with state laws, not federal laws on these federal lands, state laws. And they have to then have it signed off on or signed off by the Secretary of the Interior or the Secretary of Agriculture. This is just a monumentally impossible list of things to meet that is wrapped in a cloak of hiding behind the best available science. This looks like a section that says, well, as long as you can prove it and it's reasonable, then you can promulgate that rule. This basically makes it impossible. And then Section 434 says, you know what? Under the Toxic Substances Control Act, the federal government cannot regulate the content of lead ammunition or fishing tackle. So they can't say how much can or cannot be used. I think at the very least, they should have the option. So these are things that we would love to see stripped out of this bill moving forward. And one more thing I'll toss in is that in the president's budget, the president had said that he wanted to zero out funds for a program called the Urban Bird Treaty. This provides grants to cities, to towns, sometimes to counties, to make urban spaces safer for birds. And there are species of birds like black rail, like least bell's vireos, that are migratory, that are endangered and threatened, that still pass through our cities and need these safe havens. The president's budget zeroed it out, and then the House's budget didn't technically zero it out, it just made no mention of it. So if this version of the bill were to go forward, there is no guarantee that that program will continue to exist because it was never called out as a specific line item. Nowhere in the language does it say, we need to fund the Urban Bird Treaty at this level. So not only do we need to worry about things that are in the bill, sometimes we need to worry about the things that are not in the bill. But what I'm so excited about today is now you have the information, you know the experts on these different things. We've all learned some really cool stuff. And now we're going to learn what we can do to fix it. We won before, we're going to win again, and Dalton and Ben are going to tell us how.
Well, so well said. And somebody in the chat said something to that effect where we're getting all this information. It's so disheartening, but I need some hope. I need to know what I can do with this. And Ben is going to kind of carry us through that. I do just want to say the House is very narrow, right? Both parties, it's separated by a difference of 5. And a lot of times, many folks don't show up for a vote. So things are being decided by just a handful of votes. And you would be, and we'll talk about this a little bit later about where your House rep stands. You would be amazed at some of the people that have tanked legislation that were never on anybody's radar because they were hearing from constituents, from organizations, from folks that were passionate about wildlife protections, and so on. And so we're going to talk about some of the strategies that we can employ that we know work. And I'm going to toss it over to Ben to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you, Dalton. Much appreciated. Thanks to all my colleagues who went prior who did such a great job of providing an understanding of what's at stake in terms of the issues. Did a great job. I actually learned a ton, so I really appreciate that. I just want to jump in, as Dalton said, with a message of hope. We heard what's at stake and what is at risk in terms of should this appropriations bill continue to move forward. The good news is that we know in terms of organizing and advocacy that as we work to defend against bad appropriations riders and the policy provisions that are currently included within the House Space Bill, we know that organizing works. And in fact, we have a great case study that I'll go into at a little bit more depth here on the next slide regarding how we can do that and what we did. But earlier this year, we had a great example where a bad ESA bill was to be voted on the House floor, the Westerman's 1897 bill, the ESA Amendments Act, and was actually pulled twice, including on Earth Day. And so we got a big win there. And I'll go into a little bit more of what we learned here in just a second. And I think this was alluded to prior with Jewel in terms of the interconnected nature of advocacy, both for wildlife and on behalf of the ESA. To put that a little bit more into a clearer picture, when we're advocating for grizzly bears and we're advocating for wolves and we're advocating for continued funding for the ESA with members of Congress, a lot of times those messages just come out that people care about wildlife and people care about the Endangered Species Act. So as you're doing, reaching out to members of Congress, to your senators, to your House member, know that not only is your advocacy benefiting the specific ask and the specific provision that you're advocating for, but it's doing a solid for imperiled species that are protected under the ESA and the ESA itself. So, committing to this work and taking action on behalf of this issue today is going to pay dividends down the road. Go ahead, Dalton, next slide. So, as I mentioned, we got a big win in April. Representative Westerman 2 times tried to bring a very bad ESA bill to the floor that would fundamentally alter the integrity of the Endangered Species Act. And it was defeated twice. The second time on Earth Day, of which happened to coincide with a big fly-in where over 70 ESA advocates came from across the country to advocate and advocate against the passage of this bill. And we got news that day that that Republican leadership had yanked the bill from floor consideration. And we learned a number of lessons from that. One is that the ESA is still popular. There's a lot of people who, from across the country, hundreds of thousands, who weighed in against the Westerman bill because the Endangered Species Act is something that they care about. Poll after poll continues to show that well over 80% of Americans support the Endangered Species Act once they have an idea of what it is. Another little thing that we learned about in the realm of politics is that Eastern Republicans see the ESA in a far different lens than that of their colleagues in the West. The House Natural Resources Committee, which is the committee of jurisdiction for the ESA, largely loaded with Republicans who are from the West, who are all, I say this with a straight face, rather extreme when it comes to public lands and wildlife related issues. Often they're the megaphone for their party in terms of these issues. What we learned in the lead up to and prior to the Westerman bill getting pulled is that Eastern Republicans totally see the ESA very differently. And they played a huge role in actually ensuring that that bill wasn't voted on. We also learned that administrative actions that abuse or weaken the ESA can strengthen congressional resolve to defend the ESA. The example of that is the God Squad decision, this egregious abuse of power that the Trump administration used to exempt species in the Gulf of Mexico from the Endangered Species Act. That played a huge role in bringing especially Florida Republicans to the defense of the ESA in Congress, and a completely different issue. But the politics of that being so poor helped us. And so MAGA stalwarts like Anna Paulina Luna were on our side in terms of not supporting Westerman in the lead up of a potential vote, even posting a "Don't Tread on Me" version of a flag that said that was with a sea turtle. And so, we've learned that these administrations' actions against the ESA are helping us in Congress. They're not popular. We also learned that species-focused messaging is an asset. A lot of what we talked about today was species-focused. There are a lot of popular species around the country that are protected by the ESA. In Florida, two great examples are sea turtles and manatees. Whales are another example. Here in the Midwest, despite, in the West, wolves are very controversial, and to a certain extent they are here too, but wolves are really a driver of ESA advocacy in the Great Lakes region. So, putting forward species definitely helps in terms of messaging. And then finally, as a movement, the Endangered Species Act still drives people to action. Once you know about it, people who know about the ESA are likely to take action. And we saw people weigh in from across the country in the lead up to that vote, and that played a huge role in that bill getting pulled from the floor on Earth Day. Next slide. And so, how we organize this is just a few just quick examples: using social media, advocating for a specific bill or against a specific bill on decision makers' social media platforms and our own. Letters to the editor sounds old school, still very much works. You'd be surprised how many congressional staffers still pick up the newspaper and scan letters to the editor. It happens, I promise you, still to this day. Share with your circles. Social media, connecting people can be a great tool. It's how I primarily use social media, is to get word out about threats and provide opportunities for people to take action. Social media is just one way to share with your circle. You can also do events, have individual conversations with like-minded individuals. There's a lot of ways for you to allow folks to take action on behalf of the Endangered Species Act and species themselves. Pay your member of Congress a visit. All members of Congress, both senators and individual House members, have district offices. Those are offices where you can call up and schedule a meeting. You can even kind of go in and give them a handwritten letter. These are offices that are open. Pay them a visit. Feel free to use your voice in that perspective. It's actually very powerful, and tactically, I think, one of our strongest assets in terms of how we advocate for and against pieces of legislation federally. And then also the last one, and I'll turn it over to Dalton because that's what we're going to be doing today, is calling your member of Congress. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dalton George.
And I'll just emphasize because this blew my mind when I heard it. If you're like a country bumpkin like me that never worked with Congress much until you started hanging out with the Endangered Species Coalition, I did not realize until I talked to Jewel, who had worked on the Hill, something like letters to the editor or big social media hits. There are people whose jobs it is in these congressional offices to look at when their person is mentioned, right? Their member of Congress is mentioned and then flag it. And so it doesn't matter if it's in a small newspaper, to Ben's example of the ESA amendments win that we got, a number of small newspapers across the country actually, and letter to the editors there, played a role in getting the attention of the member of Congress. So never convince yourself just because you've got a small paper, it's not the New York Times in your neck of the woods or whatever, that it doesn't matter, because oftentimes the more local, the more representative of your community it is, the smaller it is, actually, the more attention it may get. So I just think that's so important to emphasize, and it blows my mind. Last couple of things about your house rep. So before, we've given you this huge map of here's the people we think are going to say yes, here's the people we think we're going to say no. And we don't have that today. And I think it's important that we talk to all of these legislators the same way and just tell them we have concerns about this piece of legislation, the riders listed in it. We'll talk a little bit about those riders in a moment. And it's worth calling them. It doesn't matter if you think they're going to vote the right way or not, because you would be surprised. I mean, some of the people that voted supporting anti-wildlife legislation in committee were the same ones that bailed that allowed us to win this past April. And so there's really never such a thing as a done deal. And as we all ring our congressperson, I'll be calling mine, who is somebody that probably is not in the camp we can get. It's Virginia Fox. But I don't believe that we should make an excuse for these House reps that we think don't agree with us. They need to hear from people in their communities about what really matters to us and what we value as individuals and constituents that make up the folks that get them elected, right? And the folks that they are meant to represent. And so don't make it easy for them. Don't bail them out and say, this person doesn't agree with me, I'm not going to bug them. If anything, that's very self-defeatist, right? We don't want to make it to where the people we disagree with never get any pressure. And so here is a very simple script that we've written, and really it doesn't have to be anything bigger than this. And you say, hey, my name is, I would be, I'm Dalton George, and I live in Boone, North Carolina. I'm a constituent of you, Congresswoman Fox, and I urge the rep to oppose HR 9171, the House version of the Interior and Environmental Appropriations Bill, because there's over 24 sections that would devastate wildlife and wild places. And then I would throw out a couple of reasons why that we've heard today, like about the delisting of the wolf or the grizzly, or the attack on public lands that Tim shared, or the dismantling of protections of the bird and the sage grouse. And so we have a handy dandy link if you don't know who your house rep is. And I also know that this can kind of get nerve wracking, but the great thing about doing this during the day, y'all, is we might actually get a live one. Okay. This is the first webinar. You might actually get a live staffer to answer your call. And we're all going to do it. So we're going to take 5 minutes. And I get that it's also a little nerve wracking if this is your first time doing it. And I want to name that. But also think about the power that we have with well over 100 people across the nation. We saw where everybody was calling their house rep at the same time and saying this is a bad bill, and continuing to practice that skill set. So I'm going to stop talking so it's easier for y'all to call. And I'm going to go ahead and call my house rep as well. And we're going to leave a voicemail, but stick around. We're going to have a quick Q&A, and I'm going to provide some further resources. So don't bail right now. We have just a couple more things to talk about. We should still get you out of round two, but let's take 2 minutes. I'll set a timer, and we're going to call our house reps. So I see our panelists still leaving a message or talking to somebody, so I'll wait just a couple of more seconds to let them wrap up.
I got a live one. I had an actual conversation. That was great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I unfortunately got a voicemail, but I think it's so great seeing everybody leaving a message or talking. I think Jewel and Ben also got a live one. What about you, Kristen?
A voicemail, but nonetheless, got it done.
Yeah. Also, if it was anybody's first time calling, can you say so in the chat? I want to celebrate you because I know that's a big deal and it can be kind of nerve-wracking. So if it's anybody's first time, please sound off in the chat and we'll go ahead and continue because I know we've got limited time before the hours. A lot of y'all were very information oriented. That's kind of the vibe of a coalition space like this, folks that care about wildlife. And we have this appropriations riders, which is a list of all of the anti-wildlife, anti-wild places riders. We will send this out. We will also put a link in the chat right now. Um, and we'll pull that together. But this is really exhaustive. And as you're looking to formulate a letter to the editor or call your rep again, kind of gives you a couple of sections to pull out that are really personally kind of that you personally care about, that you're passionate about, maybe that you think your community will identify with. So maybe you have a gray wolf population near you or a grizzly or something related to some of these bird protections. So that's the link right there that Jewel just put in. And again, we will send that out. But it's huge, and we really appreciate having this as a resource. And now, folks, we have some time for a few questions. I know we've got a couple in the Q&A that were answered, but I don't know if any of the panelists would like to share some questions or reiterate things that they answered in the chat that they think is helpful. But I will just note how meaningful it is to see so many people take time out of their day to be on here and try to learn and try to figure out what we can do to show up for the things that we care about. I want to thank all the organizations for being dedicated to this as well and sharing this with their folks. And it makes me feel a lot more optimistic about the work and the fight that we're in, knowing there's people across the nation in it with me that care just as much and want to learn and show up. So, um, got a couple of questions, and I will invite folks to answer them. Will you be providing the script in your packet for folks? Yes, we will send out a copy of that script as well. And we'll do a recap email that you'll get probably tomorrow. Um, we are organizing nationwide, kind of like, I mean, this is kind of part of that nationwide campaign, to be honest with you. And I think that we're still trying to evolve. A number of these organizations are working on that. But there will for sure be ways to plug in and help.
I'll pipe in that we tend to send our email tool closer to when there's a vote or we see some movement. So look for that in a couple weeks, or we might do it ahead of time. But yeah, right now we know we know that they're not voting on it next week, and they're not likely to vote on it the week of June 22nd. Potentially we could start to see it right around the 4th of July, but maybe not. But yeah, definitely we'll have that kind of email campaign as component to this as well, or just kind of seeing how what the good moment could be.
It seems like questions are kind of, yeah, that we don't tread on me, Christina. Actually, we sent that to our comms person here at the Endangered Species Coalition because we would love to see some of that as well. And yeah, so we'll close out. I'll invite any of the panelists that would like to just kind of give some final thoughts before we head out. But this to reiterate the importance of this space and people that are willing to show up and how much that means to me to know that across the nation we have people that are dedicated to our wildlife and our environmental protections. But Chris, I saw you come off mute, so.
Yeah, I just want to encourage people no matter how small you think it is, I've definitely seen it in action. I think Dalton, you said this before, like it literally can be, 20 people calling an office can make the difference of whether that rep votes yes or no. Because if they don't hear anything, they just assume everybody's for it. And so, please, please, please call, encourage your family and friends to reach out and call too. It's the smallest amount of people can make such a big difference. And thank you all for caring so much and being involved. It's really super inspiring, and we did it before. We can definitely do it again.
Awesome. Anyone else? Come on, Ben, Hardy, Jewel, Tim. Y'all got some words of wisdom before we start. There we go, Hardy.
All right, since we got the bald eagle up here, I'll say the only reason we have bald eagles in North America today is because of people speaking up, people reaching out to their representatives, people letting Congress and their government know that it was a priority that we not let this species go extinct. And it worked. These birds have been delisted. They've been removed from the Endangered Species Act because of collective action. And we just learned how to do it today. We got the background information. You're going to get it all in writing. I can't wait to see what we're all going to do together. We're going to win this. And I'm just so excited to be doing it with you all.
Yeah, I'll close with one just little tip. I think along with as Dalton mentioned, I think I've elevated a little bit too. There's still traditional local media still has a power and influence over members of Congress. I too worked in a congressional office and spent a lot of time clipping out letters to the editor to show the congressman who I worked for. They still have an impact today. The other, my favorite little tactic in terms of getting the attention of your member of Congress or your senators is a handwritten letter. It sounds like something that we don't really do anymore as a society, but because of that, it gets a lot of attention. I had a member of Congress once. We did a letter writing campaign for a public lands effort, and they literally called up our office and said, "Okay, thanks, we get it. That's enough. Let's sit down and talk." And so, their office was sick of reading letters and having to respond. So, um, if you want to just send a quick letter to your senators and your member of Congress, simple message around the importance of the ESA and the wildlife. It's another little important tactic and tip. And thanks everybody for jumping on.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. And we will be in touch. We'll get this video uploaded to YouTube so you can share it around to your circles and your community. There's always people in your life that trust you, value what you're talking about, and activating that friend or family member to care as much about wildlife as you do has a huge impact. And be looking out to your email for a lot of the information and the tools that we provided that will go out in the Zoom confirmation email sometime